This is the Miller Philosopher. With the upcoming movie Dune Part 2 coming out, there's a lot of high expectations being set. Having met high praise from critics, YouTubers, and reviewers alike who have been allowed to see the movie early, if this movie somehow failed, it would be a huge shock, though not likely based on the success of the previous film. So, expecting it to become a successful franchise based off a popular book series, some have naturally begun asking the question if the Dune franchise will rival the success of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings adaptations from 23 years ago, an adaptation that is still popular and highly regarded still to this day. I have done a video on that particular topic, which I will leave a link to below, but having said all that, based off these similar circumstances, it's also curious to note that JRR Tolkien actually read the original book Dune from Frank Herbert. Since both were considered standards for their respective genres at the time, one might think that he would have high regard for Dune, since it was well known for its philosophical depth, political range, and expansive world building. However, this was not the case. In the only recorded mention from the Lord of the Rings author about Herbert's successful book, he says, rather disturbingly, that he, quote, disliked with some intensity the book Dune. Tolkien then refuses to elaborate any further on that, or what or why Herbert's novel triggered him so much. This was surprising to me because of not just the points I mentioned above, but because Tolkien was rather well known in the literary world for supporting up-and-coming authors, even if they and their works did not share his personal views or beliefs. So, what's Tolkien's beef with Dune then? Why the exception? Now, be warned. Everything I say from here is going to be pure speculation, so don't take it as fact. Again, you are warned. So I think the answer to this question lies in Tolkien's equally well-quoted stance on allegory. On that subject, he says, quote, I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations, and always have done so since I grew up old and wary enough to detect its presence. I much prefer history, true or feigned, with its varied applicability to the thought and experience of readers, unquote. So, to be clear, allegory essentially is a work of art, be it story or book or whatever, that can be interpreted to reveal a hidden meaning, which is typically a moral or political one. Having said that, I also found that as I looked more into this, that Tolkien's relationship with allegory was much more complicated than what is often quoted or seems to be. Tolkien talks about his dislike of the concept more than once, but also later on seems to show some nuance in that belief as well. From letter 131, he says, quote, I dislike allegory, the conscious and intentional allegory, yet any attempt to explain the purport of myth or fairy tale must use allegorical language, unquote. And sometimes it seems he is referencing allegory without saying it specifically. From letter 142, quote, The Lord of the Rings is of course a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision, unquote. And at one point he seems to actually contradict his opinion, saying from letter 186, quote, Of course my story is not an allegory of a time of power, but of power, unquote. Yet, despite these contradictions, or dare one might argue hypocrisy, Tolkien maintained his popular view on allegory in his famous relationship with another author, C.S. Lewis, who, famously, wrote the equally popular The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, a book considered to be intentionally allegorical for Christianity. And this seems to have been a fair bit of friendly contention between the two that the friends just disagreed on. So, all this leads to the question then, what's the deal? And how does this all reflect back to Frank Herbert's Dune? Frank Herbert wrote 6 books of the Dune series, with the theme of never trusting charismatic leaders and institutions because they oftentimes have ulterior motives that they either trick and manipulate their followers into. And that throughout the series, Most of the characters do fall into or are manipulated into trusting in these charismatic leaders and institutions, usually to the detriment of themselves, billions of others, as well as Dune's larger universe as a whole. Frank Herbert died before he could write the final book to the series, but it's fair to say that there's not a lot of hope in the books. Paul Atreides, the protagonist of Dune and the progenitor of his bloodline throughout the series, starts out as the typical hero type, inspiring hope in the local Desert Fremen tribes to overthrow the rival, tyrannical House Harkonnen and become Emperor of the universe. In other words, he's the Aragorn of Dune, if you will. But then the following books take a sharp dive off a deep cliff, as it were, when it becomes apparent that Paul does not become the righteous and good ruler like Aragorn, but rather just as tyrannical, if not more so, than the universe's previous rulers. There are reasons for this, of course, and I'm not going to dive into them, but suffice it to say that his armies kill so many people that the character becomes a shadow of the young boy that we met in the original book. And I think this is the answer to why Tolkien disliked the novel so much. Like I said earlier, Tolkien was well known for supporting authors who had different views than his own. And on the subject of allegory, even if it somehow slipped into his works, it was something he seems to have tried to avoid at all costs if he could. Also, Tolkien's works could become very dark as well, with resolutions to evil characters oftentimes not coming until much, much further along in the book, with the people who the evil characters had beef with oftentimes either being dead by that time or just a long way off that they have to wait. Just look at the family of Huron from the canon Silmarillion, where Morgoth, for all intents and purposes, pretty much gets away with screwing over his entire family, and screws them over pretty bad, mind you. And none of them are left alive to see the justice that comes to him at the end of the First Age. But I think Frank Herbert's allegory that threads itself throughout his novels was just so dark, so depressing, and so cynical in its views on humanity, leadership, and institutions that it just crossed the line for Tolkien. Perhaps that would have been Tolkien's Return of the King sequel that was rumored to have been so dark that he just chose not to continue it. Well, I couldn't find any quotes to see if Frank Herbert had read any of Tolkien's books or not. It seems to me, based on his views in Dune, that he would have equally disliked with some intensity the characters of Aragorn and Frodo because they were occupying that messianic place in the novels, where people were placing their trust in them and following them, whether it was intentional or not. Both Lord of the Rings and Dune have similar traits that make them both great reads, and that this also translates into their film adaptations as well. However, their fundamental themes directly contradict each other in such a way that it can in no way be avoided, sidestepped, or passed over as a minor point, that they are the mirror opposite of each other. Essentially, Frank Herbert maintained a dark and cynical look at the world and its institutions and the idea of following them and its charismatic leaders, whereas Tolkien, while sharing that evil does exist in the world, still held on to the idea of eucatastrophe, that hope still exists and could still happen despite all the evil that tends to exist and seems to almost run free. Tolkien, despite how dark his writings can get, oftentimes made efforts to put into his writings that the idea of hope still existed, and that he usually tried to end a novel or a series on that note. He didn't like, apparently, to just end on a dark note where everything just goes to shit and end the story. And perhaps Frank Herbert would have done the same if he had been able to finish his final book. We'll never know. But, having said all that, what are your thoughts? Do you prefer Dune or Lord of the Rings? Or do you like both of them? Do you think that the movies will become as successful and well known for the Dune franchise as Lord of the Rings was for the Lord of the Rings franchise? Let me know in the comments below. But otherwise, this is the Miller Philosopher, and you guys have a good day.